Today we'll be hearing from Professor Helen Ball. So Professor Ball is a professor of anthropology and the director of Durham Infancy and Sleep Center at Durham University. Amongst her areas of expertise are infant and child sleep, circadian biology, breastfeeding, and parenting behavior. In addition to her roles already listed, she serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Human Lactation, is an associate editor for the journal Sleep Health, and is a board member of the International Society for the Study and Prevention of Infant Deaths. She has been a recipient of many awards, including the Patricia Martins Award for Excellence in Breastfeeding Research, the Economic and Social Research Council Celebrating Impact Award for Outstanding Impact in the Community. In 2018, Durham University was also awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for Professor Ball's research on parent-infant sleep. She's also the co-founder of BASIS, the Baby Sleep Info Source, which is a website which provides parents with easily accessible and understandable scientific information so that they can make informed decisions about sleep and nighttime care for their infants. So with that, let's please welcome Professor Helen Ball.
Thanks very much for that great introduction. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to come and talk about what we do with mother-baby sleep and biology, behavior, etc. I'm going to share my screen and you can tell me if this shows up clearly for you all. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's clear.
Okay, right, I'm just trying to move it into the middle so that I'm not looking to one side. Great. All right then, so yes, this is a program of research that's been going on for about 30 years now at Durham. So I came to Durham in 1993 and I started studying as a primatologist when I first arrived, but after having my first two children and realizing that a field site on the other side of the world and two small children didn't really work, I switched my research to using ethological techniques to study mother-baby nighttime behavior. So let's see if I can make the slides change now. Come on, next one. There we go. All right, so the work that we do is kind of predicated on this basic premise that human babies are mammal babies. And we have, as mammal babies, we've got an inbuilt set of needs that we as parents need to meet. So some babies, as we know, have to survive all by themselves from the moment they emerge from the egg, etc. But mammal babies have the luxury of parental care. And when we think about mammal babies, we tend to think about them falling into two broad categories. Those who are altricial at birth and those who are precocial at birth. So just to recap what that means, babies who are born in an altricial state, that is, they're undeveloped. When they're born, they have a short gestation period and they continue their development in a nest. So when they're born, they can't see or hear or call or thermoregulate very well, various things, they're hairless. So they stay in the nest until they're well developed enough to be able to go out and follow their mother foraging. Whereas precocial infants have a longer gestation period, and by the time they're born, they can see, they can hear, they can call, they can get up and they can walk and follow their mothers. And that's got implications, of course, for the way in which parents or mothers generally take care of their infants. So altricial babies, as I said, parental investment involves the construction of a nest primarily to keep the babies safe and warm. And altricial babies are fed infrequently. Mothers produce high-fat milk, which satiates babies for long periods. So the mothers can go off, forage, leave their babies in what they hope is a safe place, and come back and feed them once or twice during the course of 24 hours. For precocial babies, the picture looks quite different. So when they're born, they can maintain proximity with their mothers either by clinging like primates or getting up and following like most other animals. And mothers of precocial babies produce low-fat milk. Doesn't have to satiate babies for long periods. Babies can feed at will because they're with their mothers all the time, but it needs to provide them with energy. So they produce high sugar content milk. So that kind of sets the pattern for what we might expect to see in humans. And in humans, we see babies that are, for all intents and purposes, precocial in their characteristics at birth. They're single, they have well-developed internal and sensory organs, they can see, they can hear, they can call. And as mothers, we produce that low-fat, high sugar content milk. Our babies need to feed frequently, so they fit the precocial pattern. But one of the key characteristics of human babies is that at birth, we have poor neuromuscular control. We aren't able to follow, get up and stand up and follow our mothers, and we aren't able to even cling to them because our brain is so undeveloped at birth compared to what its adult volume will be. So we're born with a brain size that's about 25% of the adult final brain size compared to 50% in other primates. So human babies have poorer neuromuscular control and poorer coordination than other precocial mammal newborns, but they have those same needs for frequent feeding, contact, and care, intensive caregiving from the mother. So they're highly, or we are highly dependent on a carer to maintain proximity in those first few months of life, and we have an extended period of dependency. So all of that means, basically from the point of view of what happens to mothers and babies at night, is that contact and night waking are completely normal and expectable behavioral traits for humans. Human babies finish their gestation outside of the womb while their brains are growing still rapidly at the fetal rate of growth throughout the first year. And they need close contact for warmth, for security, and for biological regulation. So human babies need their caregivers day and night for several months. And during this time period, they don't have a day-night rhythm. So we're born with no circadian cycle. We were operating on our mother's circadian cycle while we were fetuses. And we don't establish our own circadian rhythm until it starts to establish when we're about 4 months old. It doesn't finish until we're about a year old or older. And babies can't sleep for long periods. They haven't got consolidated sleep. They sleep for a couple of hours and then they wake up. So sleeping close to a carer, if we're thinking about it from that kind of an evolutionary mammalian kind of perspective, sleeping close to a carer is what sleeping like a baby really means. So when we start to study the way in which we take care of babies in Western societies, it's easy to see some of the mismatches between our evolved biology and our cultural practices. So this concept of weird societies, it's got various problems associated with it, but as a kind of way of demonstrating how our behavior and our biology are mismatched, it's a useful thing to talk about. So we're historically and cross-culturally unusual in weird societies in separating parents and babies at night. And the fact that we've done that historically for the last 100-odd years affects the way in which we understand infant sleep. It affects the way in which infant sleep studies and research has been done over the last several decades, and it affects what parents expect from their babies. So if we have a look historically at how parents and babies used to sleep, we can see that putting babies to sleep by themselves is historically novel. Prior to the early 20th century, infant social sleep was quite a normal thing. You can find examples of it in artworks like this one that Yorkshire artist Fred Elwell painted called The Firstborn. You can find examples in books written by doctors that were the first kind of advice guides to mothers in the 1800s that talk about mothers and babies being together at night as being the kind of the normal practice. And what really happened, I mean, there was the influence of industrialization and the fact that you began to get a class of business owners who were able to build large houses with enough bedrooms for all of their children to be able to sleep by themselves. That was one of the things that happened. But ideologically, something that happened was the 1920s era of scientific baby care. And scientific baby care was a movement driven by a lot of educated men who were experts in various fields, who were of the opinion that mothers needed advice on how to raise children. And the dominant scientific ideologies of the time were around independence, self-control, and self-reliance. And this is what mothers' job was, to create independent, self-controlled, and self-reliant children. And some of them used behaviorism. So John B. Watson was a behaviorist psychologist who, this involves, things like classical and operant conditioning, and felt that you needed to treat children in a certain way to get a particular kind of adult. And affection was one of those things that did not produce desirable adults. So to Watson, no child could have too little affection. Fathers weren't supposed to show any affection to their children. Mothers were supposed to kiss them on the forehead. Well, that was as much as affection as they were allowed to show them. The other bloke in this picture is Truby King. He's a New Zealand physician, and he was very influential in both promoting breastfeeding, but also promoting babies getting fresh air and exercising their lungs. So Truby King babies spent hours parked outside at the bottom of the garden in their prams, staring at the sky, crying, and getting lots of fresh air in their lungs. And the influence of these guys lingers in many of the assumptions that we hear about babies today. Not picking babies up because you'll spoil them comes from this era. Crying being good for their lungs, as we've said, comes from this era. All sorts of things that people have about, spoiling babies, etc., come from the 1920s. Of course, after that, there was lots of research that was done by different people, such as Bowlby and Harlow, who kind of emphasized the importance of physical contact and warmth and comfort for babies. Harlow's experiments obviously demonstrated how this was of vital importance for infants' development. Bowlby's studies of of orphans, etc., demonstrated how it was of importance for human infants. But Western fashions in infant care have obviously changed much more rapidly over the last century or so than infant evolutionary biology has. So we've got babies who are biologically expecting one set of things to happen to them, to be cared for like a precocial infant, and culturally we're doing quite different things. If we look around the world, the majority of human cultures who are not influenced by Western societies expect their babies to be in contact with them day and night, and in fact have devised many different ways of keeping babies in close contact during, all sorts of activities, particularly productive work. But what we do in Western societies really is to try and cash them as if they're nest dwelling animals. And the classic kind of nursery with a crib is an attempt to sequester a human baby in something that resembles a nest. So when we think then about how people understand what normal infant sleep might entail, we can think of it in at least three different ways. I've got three different examples here. We've got what people consider to be culturally normal. So that's what the dominant socio-historical ideology says in different cultural groups is what you should do. So in our society, that might mean good babies sleep all the time. Crying is good for babies. Babies will get spoiled if you pick them up too much. They won't learn to sleep if you rock them and cuddle them. They must be taught to self-soothe. Those are kind of lots of the tales that new parents hear from people around them. On the other hand, you've got what might be considered statistically normal. What is the normal or average range within a given population for things to do with infant sleep? For instance, parents are often given charts or tables of how much sleep their baby should be getting at different ages. So statistical normalcy comes in when we hear things like babies must get 18 hours of sleep a day at 5 months, or they should be sleeping for a 5-hour stretch at night when they're 3 months, or they need 3 2-hour naps a day for optimal cognitive development. This is all based on kind of studies that just take the average across a sample of babies. And of course, not all babies sit on the average for anything. So parents get themselves quite anxious if their baby isn't doing what the statistically normal thing is supposed to be. And then, of course, we've got biologically normal, what is based on the evolved physiology of the mother-baby dyad. And that might mean that babies are born with this set of physiological survival needs that must be met by their carers, that the mother and the baby are an evolved dyad with entwined biology, and biology drives infant sleep. It's not a learned skill. And while that might seem kind of like normal to me, who's been trained in evolutionary biology, that is not something that most parents are exposed to. So if we think about where some of these culturally normal ideas have come from then, and the statistically normal ideas, one of the key first ones was this idea that babies should be sleeping through the night. And they should be sleeping through the night, according to most parenting guides and pediatric textbooks, by the time they're 3 months of age. And this bit of info came from a study that was done in 1957, where Morinaco studied 160 babies to define what normal infant sleep was. That was their goal in doing this piece of research, to define normal infant sleep. And they kind of created a definition of sleeping through the night, and that was that a baby was sleeping through the night if the parents didn't report any crying or fussing from the baby from midnight to 5 a.m. And they found, using this criterion, that 70% of the babies that they studied began to sleep through the night, or began to sleep from midnight to 5 at 3 months of age. And that's gotten codified in all of the guidance to parents and pediatricians. But if you go back and you read their original paper, you see that they also reported that half of those babies that began sleeping through the night, or sleeping midnight to 5 at 3 months of age, half of them reverted back to night waking in a month or so. But that bit never gets passed on to parents. And we also have to remember that in 1957, the majority of babies weren't fed human milk. They slept on their fronts, which makes them sleep more deeply. And they slept in a separate room where the parents were less likely to hear if they were crying or fussing between midnight and 5 a.m. So it's a very sort of culturally constrained piece of research that was done at a particular time in a particular place where babies were cared for in a particular way, but it has been used to kind of justify guidance to parents that their babies, there's something wrong with their baby if it's not sleeping through the night from 3 months of age. And of course, most parents don't realize that what researchers call sleeping through the night is not what they call sleeping through the night. So most pediatric and popular knowledge then is based on studies of formula-fed babies sleeping alone from the 1950s and the 1960s. And because of that, parents and pediatricians, certainly in this country, often consider infant night waking to be a problem after 3 months. But of course, for breastfed babies, it's normal and it's expectable. Babies digest breast milk very quickly. They feel hungry again in a couple of hours. And as a consequence, parents often are encouraged to give their baby, to supplement their baby's diet. So I think I've got some quotes from parents coming up from focus groups that we did, but parents believe that giving their baby formula, or formula with some kind of thickener in it, like baby rice or baby cereal, is going to help their babies start to sleep through the night, or what they call encourage early settling, which is the phase when the baby starts to fall quickly into deep sleep and stay asleep for a prolonged period. So one of the things that is different about baby sleep and adult sleep is that when we fall asleep, we go into deep sleep straight away, which is why if you're woken shortly after you've gone to sleep, you feel kind of disoriented because your brain has plummeted from kind of like drowsiness to deep sleep. Whereas babies fall into active sleep for about 20 or 30 minutes before they go into deep sleep. So the phase at which babies start to fall into deep sleep straight away is known as settling. And encouraging babies to do that as early as possible has been a desirable parenting goal for the last 70 odd years. So it's kind of what parents think one of their jobs is, to get their baby to sleep deeply as early as possible. So we were curious about what parents thought about infant sleep. And we've done numerous interview and focus group studies. So this is just some data from one of those that one of my postdocs did in, well, she did her study around 2012. She published this in 2016. And it was a focus group study with 7 focus groups, adolescent and adult mums, mix of ethnicities, all had babies under a year old. Some were breastfeeding, some were formula feeding. And she was trying to get them to kind of discuss what their different opinions were about baby sleep and how babies should be feeding and how babies should be sleeping and how sleeping is related to feeding type. And we heard a bunch of different views. So 20 years previously, in my first interview studies, I had heard the first view, what we called the original view. And that was that parents were saying things like, if you're breastfeeding them, you don't know how much milk they're getting. If they're hungry, if they've not had enough milk, they could wake up again in a couple of hours later. So they're not understanding that breastfed babies wake frequently because they digest breast milk quickly because it's low in fat. They're assuming that they wake frequently because they've not had enough, and you can't tell how much they're getting when you breastfeed. And another one said, formula and sleep is the key, breastfeeding and sleep isn't happening. So I've heard that for kind of like 20 odd years in different ways from parents. But in these focus groups, Alana also got a new kind of response. And the new response was, I think it's quite an old-fashioned notion that they need formula to sleep better. My mother-in-law and my auntie, who are of that older generation, they're like, he's not sleeping through, you need a bottle, you need to give him formula and solids. I was told that at 3 months, and this mum laughed. And she said, I was like, no, I don't think he does. So the narrative was starting to change around the relationship between sleeping and feeding for some new mothers, particularly younger generation. And these ideas that people had about the way in which babies slept and fed kind of affected their understanding of what babies needed. So the first group would say things like this: I've always had all of them in a routine. I believe a baby fits around your routine, you don't fit around theirs. That's a very John B. Watson and Frederick Truby King kind of idea. Whereas these other mothers would say, babies sleep when they need it and forget it. You've got to work around them, and that's all there is to it. As often as she wakes is when she wakes. So women were beginning to accept and understand that babies' biology caused them to sleep in a particular way, and you were the one who had to be flexible rather than the baby fitting around you. And those different ideas about what babies need and how sleep works led to the way in which parents treated their babies with regards to sleep and pursued different parenting strategies. So this mum, this was like a 17-year-old mum, and she said, I was getting no sleep whatsoever. So after 6 weeks, this is when the baby's 6 weeks old, I asked my mum what she'd done with us, and she says, like, do the tough love thing, which she means put the baby in its room, shut the door and let it cry. So I tried it and I stuck it out, and after 2 weeks, she slept all night. So she left the baby to cry in its own room for 2 weeks. And eventually the baby gave up crying and didn't disturb her in the night anymore. So from her perspective, that worked. That was a successful strategy. But it shows no understanding of anything about kind of like babies' evolved biology or needs or anything. On the other hand, we got mums who were predominantly breastfeeding who would say things like, if he's having a night where he wants to nurse a lot, I'll bring him in bed with me and I'll just sleep. And he latches on when he wants to, and it doesn't really interrupt my sleep a great deal. So this is another strategy that they sort of figure out for themselves that helps them cope with that frequent breastfeeding at night, and kind of brings mother and baby biology back into synchrony and alignment. So we found that popular wisdom tightly linked breastfeeding with inadequate nighttime sleep. Everybody knew, or almost everybody knew, breastfeeding meant poor sleep. And the nature of infant sleep was understood differently by mothers, as was the relationship to feeding. The breastfeeding mothers viewed the fragmentary nature of infant sleep as being natural, while mothers who were formula feeding felt that it was a problem and they had to fix it. And the strategies and the approaches that they used were aligned with this underlying perception of how infant sleep works. So that sort of sets the scene for talking about some of the other research that we've done around what's actually going on when people sleep with their babies and what's going on, what's the difference in sleep behavior between breastfed and formula-fed babies. So this study takes us all the way back to the very beginning of when I started studying this topic, 1998 to 2000. We studied 253 families in a northern, normal northern town, and decided not to study families in Durham because there were too many academics in Durham, and I figured I wasn't going to get a proper picture of kind of like what people in general thought. So I studied mothers and babies in another town. They did sleep diaries for a week, and when their babies were 1 month old and 3 months old, and then we interviewed them at the end of the first and the third month. And what we were particularly interested in is where these babies were sleeping and how these babies were feeding. And we found, contrary to what everybody told me when I started this research, I said, when I would say I'm interested in finding out whether mothers and babies in the UK sleep together, they would say, oh, no, they don't. But people in England don't sleep with their babies. And I would go, but do they? Or do they just not talk about it? And what we found was that half of all the babies bed shared at some time in those first 3 months, but the difference between the breastfeeders and the formula feeders was really dramatic. The breastfeeders were much more likely to share a bed, and they didn't share a bed the way people imagined bed sharing would work. So when I talked to people about studying bed sharing, their perception was I was studying some kind of weirdo hippie parents who just never bought their baby a crib, and their baby was always attached to their bodies and slept with them all night, every night. But that isn't what happened. Most of the breastfeeding bed sharing mums did what we called combination bed sharing, which was a category we created after we found out what they were doing. And that was that babies started the night in a cot near the bed and then got brought into the parents' bed at some point during the night for the first feed. And then the mum fell asleep with the baby in the bed, and the baby just stayed there for the rest of the night. There was very, very small proportion of what we called habitual bed sharing, which was the ones who were in bed all night, every night. And then another small slice of them brought the baby into bed some nights, but not every night. Whereas if you look at the formula feeding graph, you can see that there was about a quarter of them brought their babies into bed, half of which was combination bed sharing and half of which was occasional bed sharing. And when we looked at babies of different ages, they were more likely to be bed sharing when they were really small, which makes sense because that fits with that's when they're feeding most frequently at night. And people, first of all, would say, well, there must be something really weird about that town of North Tees, because people here don't bed share that much. So I got together with the statistician from a big epidemiological sudden infant death syndrome study in the UK that had looked at thousands of families. And I said, have you got data on where the babies slept? And he said, yes. I said, well, can you break them down by the first month and the third month so that they're similar to our data, and have a look and see what your proportions are? And he did, and they were almost identical. So it wasn't that the people in North Tees were somehow weird. It was that people didn't realise that other people that they knew very well regularly brought their babies into their beds. And we also showed that breastfeeding and bed sharing was very clearly intertwined, with 72% of the babies who were breastfed for a month or more bed sharing, compared with 38% of the ones who were formula fed doing any bed sharing. So we published this back in 2004, and it was kind of the first time the prevalence of mother-baby sleep contact had been documented in the UK. And it was a huge thing to be able to talk about, really, because so many people had just assumed that this wasn't something that people in the UK did, but it was. They just didn't feel as though they could tell people about it. So as part of our interviews, one of the things that we wanted to understand was why people did this. Why did they bring their babies into bed? And obviously, you know, from the previous figures, you can guess that ease and convenience of nighttime breastfeeding was really a main reason. But there were other reasons as well. Some parents brought their babies into bed with them because they just enjoyed the close contact of being with their baby and cuddling it, etc. We got that answer from a few dads as well, who kind of like were sad about missing their baby during the day and were happy to kind of sleep with the baby at night. We also found that there were more negative reasons why people had their babies in bed. Sometimes it was because they didn't have the space to have a cot in their bedroom, or to even afford to be able to buy a cot. And sometimes it was because they were anxious about their baby's health or safety and wanted to keep a close eye on them in the night. A lot of parents who brought their babies into bed occasionally did it because when a baby's fractious or irritable, it's an easy way to settle and soothe the baby. And some families, of course, that small slice, that blue slice that I showed you, had a family bed ideology, and all their children slept with them. It was just normal. That was what they did. So when we look around at the literature at the time, shortly after we did that study, there were a number of other studies that were done over the course of the next decade that aimed to kind of assess what the prevalence of bed sharing was in other Western industrialized, post-industrial countries. And you can see here that the vast majority of them came up with a very similar percentage, around about 45 to 50, that we had found in our study. So ours is here. And all these other ones found similar proportions, except for a couple, one in Oregon and one in Canada. And these were samples that were kind of large proportion of breastfeeding mothers in these samples, so they kind of skewed the outcomes. But you know, it illustrated that bed sharing was not just something that went on in non-Western countries. It was something that was, you know, part of parenting practice, very common in Western societies. And one of the things that we hypothesized throughout all of this was to do with the relationship between mother-baby sleep contact and breastfeeding outcomes. And one of the things that is quite notable about the UK with regards to breastfeeding is that although a high proportion of mums start breastfeeding, very few carry on for very long. There's a big drop-off in breastfeeding in the UK around about 6 weeks, or in the first 6 weeks, and only 1%, although the World Health Organization recommends that all babies should be exclusively breastfed until they're 6 months of age. What proportion of babies in the UK do you think are exclusively breastfed to 6 months of age? Anybody got any ideas?
Well, did you say 1%?
Yeah, sorry, did I say it already? Sorry. Yeah, so less than 1% of babies are breastfed exclusively to 6 months of age. And one of the things that we had been interested in was this relationship between separation of mothers and babies in the early postnatal period and breastfeeding decline. So women in the UK often give up breastfeeding because they think they've not got enough milk. It's called insufficient. It used to be called insufficient milk syndrome. Now it's called perceived breast milk insufficiency or something like that. And one of the things that we knew as kind of like biologists is that for your breast milk to be sustained, production of breast milk to be sustained, babies have to be able to feed frequently day and night, because that keeps your prolactin levels high. If you don't feed frequently day and night, your prolactin levels fall between every feed. You don't build up prolactin receptors in your breast. And when breast milk production switches from being under the control of your brain to being under the control of your breast, it switches from endocrine to autocrine at about 6 or 8 weeks. If you haven't built up enough prolactin receptors in your breasts, you don't produce enough milk. And so one of the things we were interested in was whether sleep contact facilitated long-term breastfeeding, because it encouraged frequent breastfeeding at night. So I kind of pondered for quite a long time about how I was going to untangle that particular question. And what I really wanted to do was to randomize mothers and babies to sleep in different arrangements. But of course, at home, you can't force anybody to sleep in the way that you want them to. But I thought, on a postnatal ward, people do as they're told. You could like give them different sleeping arrangements, randomly allocate mums and babies to different sleeping arrangements, and you could look at how it affects their breastfeeding outcomes. So I managed to persuade a neonatologist at the RVI in Newcastle to allow me to come and film mothers and babies sleeping on the postnatal ward. In those days, they stayed in hospital for 2 nights after they'd had the baby, and to be able and to randomly allocate them to one of 3 different sleeping conditions, which you can see here. So the mums on the left had their babies in bed with them, and they've got a side rail on to make sure the baby doesn't fall out. The mums in the middle had something called a sidecar crib. It was a 3-sided bassinet that clamped to the frame of the mother's bed, and it was open between the mother and the baby, so she could easily access the baby and touch it and feed it, etc. And then this one on the right is the normal sort of postnatal care arrangement. The mum's in her bed and the baby's in a bassinet next to her, with sides, that kind of like a bit of a barrier between them. And this is rooming in. So what we did was randomly allocate these mums and babies. We filmed them all night with infrared cameras. They had a remote control, so they could stop and start the cameras anytime they wanted to. And then we coded the videos for different things, but primarily for feed frequency. We wanted to know kind of what was happening. And then we followed the mums and babies up once they went home and looked at their breastfeeding outcomes. So what we found was, and we've done 2 types of analysis. Oops, don't go away. We've done 2 types of analysis here, one looking at the number of attempted feeds and one looking at the number of successful feeds. So successful feeds were where we could hear the babies sucking and swallowing, so we knew they were transferring milk, whereas attempted feeds were successful feeds plus other times the baby went to the breast, but we weren't really sure if it was transferring milk. So that it's the second one that is going to increase the level of prolactin. So you can see here that the mums and the babies who were in the bed and the mums and the babies who were in the crib, had the sidecar crib, fed successfully about twice as many times during the course of the night as the ones who were in the standalone cot next to the bed. And that was quite an important difference, because, do I have the next slide? No, I don't. So I've got it in words. So we found that it facilitated frequent feeding, and that leads to increased prolactin production, and it influences the timing and intensity of what we call lactogenesis 2, which is when your milk comes in. And women whose milk comes in early and more copiously felt more confident in their ability to feed their babies. Their babies were less likely to get a bottle of formula while they were on the postnatal ward. And when we followed them up, and I'm sorry I didn't include this slide, I forgot about it, they were more likely to still be, twice as more likely to still be breastfeeding at 6 months as the ones who didn't sleep with their babies in the early postnatal period. So we were able to demonstrate that rooming in, although rooming in is considered better than nursery care for breastfeeding initiation, closer is better. So having the mother and the baby with no barrier between them, able to touch each other during the night and able to feed at will is better for breastfeeding outcomes. We only looked at mothers and babies who had normal non-medicated vaginal deliveries. We didn't include anybody who'd had epidurals or opiate analgesics in labor, because those things screw up breastfeeding initiation too. So this is kind of like in the what you might consider the typical biological condition for humans. Close contact does affect breastfeeding outcomes. Close contact at night does affect breastfeeding outcomes. So we went on after that to kind of document how breastfeeding mothers and babies bed share. What we found was that a lot of the breastfeeding support organisations in the UK, like UNICEF Baby Friendly, wanted to be able to talk to health professionals and parents about the research that we had done and about the importance of contact at night and how it facilitates breastfeeding, etc. But in order to be able to tell them that, they also needed to be able to tell them how to bed share safely, because at the same time all this was going on, the SIDS research world was kind of telling parents not to bed share because they would roll on their babies, they would suffocate their babies, and their babies would die of SIDS. So we had to do a series of studies looking at what actually happens to babies in bed at night with their parents and determine what was safe and what wasn't, and how to kind of give parents information about safe bed sharing. So this picture kind of encapsulates all of that research, which was a ton of lab studies and home-based studies where we videoed mothers and babies sleeping together and dads. So some studies had dads and it was triadic bed sharing. Some studies had just mums and babies. And what we found was that breastfeeding mothers slept with their babies in a very characteristic way. They curled up around their babies. They made a space for their babies to sleep in with their bodies. They almost exclusively put their arm above their baby's head. They put their knees underneath their baby's feet. The baby can't travel around the bed. It can't go up under the pillows. It can't slide down under the duvet. The mom can't roll on it because she's got her arm and her knees in front of her, so she can't roll forwards. Nobody else can roll on the baby because they've got to get over the mom's elbows and knees to get to the baby first. So it provided the baby with this kind of safe space in the adult bed. The baby's at breast height, so it's easy for the baby to breastfeed. The mom can feed and sleep at the same time. So we sort of documented all of this in minute detail. Here's the graph that I was going to show you earlier. This was a follow-up study that we did looking at parents, mothers who bed shared and who didn't, and looking at their feeding outcomes over time. And these are the ones who bed shared, and these are the ones who didn't bed share. And this is breastfeeding at 6 months. So you can see the big difference that it made. So we found this strong association then between breastfeeding and sleep location. The majority of mothers who breastfed bed shared. It facilitated nighttime feeding. It helped maintain milk supply. And many of the breastfeeding organizations highly valued mother-baby sleep contact and wanted to be able to encourage mothers and babies to do that. But we had to help them to think about the strategies that they might use to support their own and their baby's needs and minimize nighttime sleep disruption, and how to bed share safely. So one of the things that we did kind of like much more recently was to have a look, go back to this original question about babies sleep better if they have formula than they do if they have breast milk, and actually look at what was happening to those babies during the night again, but this time using actigraphy. So actigraphy is kind of a motion sensor that we can use to identify periods of sleep and wakefulness. So we recruited 50 mother-baby pairs. This was part of Alana's postdoc again. Recruited 50 mother-baby pairs from a hospital postnatal ward, and we recruited mothers who intended to either exclusively breastfeed their babies or formula feed their babies for the first 18 weeks. And we had them do sleep diaries and questionnaires like we had in the past, but this time we also put actigraphs on the baby. And what we found was there was no difference in the objective amount of sleep time that breastfed or formula-fed babies get. So the black bars are, first one is exclusively breastfed and the second one is exclusively formula-fed, but the black ones are maternal reports. And the grey ones are the same, exclusively breastfed and exclusively formula-fed, but actigraphy. And if you look at all the grey ones, there's no significant difference between them in terms of how much, what the amount of time. This was the only significant difference when they got to 18 months. And at 18 months, the breastfed babies were sleeping longer than the formula-fed babies. You can see, however, that the mother's reports start to diverge after about 8 weeks, and the formula feeding mums are thinking that their babies are getting more sleep in the night than the breastfeeding mums are thinking their babies are getting. But this became really, really apparent when we asked about the baby's longest nighttime sleep period. So this is that, when is the baby starting to sleep through? When is it starting to sleep through the night? And this is the baby's longest sleep period. So the same arrangement of the graph. You've got the mother's reports, the black bars, the actigraphy of the grey bars. If you look across the 18 weeks, the baby's longest sleep period really doesn't change. It doesn't matter what they're fed. Their longest sleep period is about 2 hours or 2 hours and a bit. But mothers are over-reporting. Right from the get-go, mothers are over-reporting, but they're over-reporting similar amounts, regardless of whether they're breastfeeding or formula feeding to begin with. But by the time they get up to about 10 weeks, when babies are supposed to be starting to sleep through the night, the formula feeding mums suddenly start over-reporting their babies' longest sleep period, much, much more than the breastfeeding. So they're all over-reporting, but the formula feeders are over-reporting even more. So this phenomenon of babies, formula feeding babies sleeping through the night is not necessarily a real one, it's a perceived one. And we can talk about all the different things that might be causing that to happen. But we didn't ask those mums kind of like why they thought their babies were sleeping through the night. We just documented the difference. So one of the things that has been discovered over the course of the time that I've been studying infant sleep is that the amount of sleep that any baby gets is hugely variable compared to the next baby. So this is the results of a systematic review looking at the 24-hour sleep duration for babies in different studies. So this is the average and the range. And you can see that the averages in the first few months, the averages in different studies are all over the place. They vary from like 12 hours up to 16 hours. But the range for individual babies goes from 8 up to 22 hours. And it isn't until babies get to be about a year or two old that this all starts to get a bit more consistent across individuals. So human variation in sleep in infancy is massive. And parents get very, very worked up if their baby is down here or their baby is up here. They think that there's something wrong with it and they need to somehow fix it, do something, change what it's eating, change how it's sleeping, etc. But one of the most important things that we've discovered about infant sleep over the last 20 or 30 years is that infant sleep is hugely variable and there's a big range of normal. Here it is presented in a different way. This is going all the way up to age 16. So you can see in the first year how variable sleep is compared to later childhood and adolescence. So in terms of how much sleep babies actually need then, the normative guidance that parents get in baby books and charts in clinic walls and stuff is really old. It reflects practices and lifestyles from 70 or more years ago now. And those studies are usually based on middle-class babies in weird societies. So the charts and the tables create all sorts of anxiety for parents whose babies aren't average. But if a baby is getting enough sleep, you'll know because it's alert and it's happy when it's awake. If it's cranky, it's not, and it's cranky all the time, then that's a sign that it might not be getting enough sleep. But if a baby's alert and happy when it's awake, it's getting enough sleep. So they don't need to worry about charts and tables and all the rest of it. But of course, parents are under a huge amount of cultural pressure when they have a new baby, because people are asking them questions about baby sleep all the time. We seem to have an obsession in our society with how other people's babies sleep. And we ask parents questions like, how's the baby sleeping? And is he sleeping through yet? And is he a good baby? Parents think that it must be important, because why else would everybody be asking about it? So when we think about babies feeding and sleeping, then what can we say, kind of like as a pull all of this stuff together? We know that human babies, from an evolutionary perspective, are born with this set of needs that don't easily fit with contemporary adult life. We've made big advances in understanding the relationship between breastfeeding and sleeping, and that helps us to understand mothers' ability to cope with nighttime infant care and the different ways they might cope with nighttime infant care in this kind of society that doesn't provide them with the support that they need. Public perceptions generally are that formula helps babies to sleep. Still, a lot of people think that, but there's now beginning to be some evidence that we can use to challenge that idea. We've demonstrated that breastfed babies get as much sleep as formula-fed babies do, but their sleep is more fragmented. And so maternal sleep quality tends to suffer rather than maternal sleep duration, but women feel as though they're getting poorer sleep. And mothers use bed sharing as a coping strategy for nighttime nursing and for sleep disturbance. And it's associated with greater breastfeeding duration because of the kind of the physiological consequences of that more frequent feeding at night. So our research has been used, all of these kinds of different things that we've managed to uncover has been used in policies like UNICEF baby-friendly standards, to change practice in hospitals and to change the information that parents are given about what to expect in the first few months of life with sleep and babies, and to provide things like this guide for parents that every baby is born in a baby-friendly hospital, and 95% of UK hospitals now are baby-friendly accredited, so most babies are born in baby-friendly hospitals get a leaflet like this that talks to them about bed sharing and about how to do it safely and about why they might end up bringing their baby into bed and kind of what that's all about. The medical establishment is beginning to accept that nighttime separation is detrimental for mothers and babies. This is a publication by the American Academy of Pediatrics, who are notoriously hardline about letting mothers and babies sleep together. But they took the research that we'd done with the sidecar cribs here in the UK and they included it in their guidance for pediatricians about safe sleep and skin-to-skin care in the neonatal period and how important it was that mothers and babies shouldn't be separated from one another. So that was good to see. Of course, we've been promoting all of these ideas through our baby sleep information source website over the years. So, you know, that gets shared by health professionals to new parents, and they have an alternative source of information about infant sleep that's more evolutionary and anthropologically and biologically based. Oh, that's just another picture of the rest of the website. So we tell them about how babies sleep, where babies sleep, sleep safety, and we've also done a bit of work on twins and sleep. One very sort of gratifying thing that happened over the course of the last decade was that the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence undertook a review of the evidence around SIDS and co-sleeping and came to the conclusion that it wasn't as strong as a lot of people had thought it was, that babies weren't dying in parents' beds. They were tending to die on sofas where parents were sleeping with babies in hazardous ways after drinking alcohol or consuming drugs and all of this kind of stuff. And that meant that we shouldn't be going around like the American Academy of Pediatrics has been doing, telling parents that they should never ever bring their babies into bed. We should acknowledge that parents sleep with their babies for lots of good reasons and that they should have the information to make an informed choice about that. And that they should be told about the circumstances under which babies die, which is smoking and drugs and alcohol and sofas and premature babies. So we have worked closely with organisations like UNICEF and the Lullaby Trust to produce information for health professionals and parents along those lines. So explaining to them about how many babies are likely to sleep with their parents, why they do it, and then what are the dangerous things that they need to avoid. And our research now is kind of in the national guidance. So you can see here, no, you did for a minute. You can see here that the Lullaby Trust, Public Health England guidance to parents now features pictures of parents and babies bed sharing, which is kind of like a huge shock to some people. But I think it's absolutely necessary to talk to parents about safe bed sharings, given that so many end up doing it. I go all over the place talking about all of this kind of stuff. So giving lectures on this to health professionals is sort of part of everyday life for me nowadays. And guidance and practices started to change, not just in the UK, but also in the US, in Australia, in Canada, in most of the English-speaking world. So it's important then, I would argue, that we talk to parents about things like bed sharing, because parents discover that babies like it. They discover it helps them cope. They discover that it makes nighttime breastfeeding easier. So they're doing it in lots of safe and unsafe ways, and talking about it helps them to do it much more safely. Simple never bed share messages prevent discussion. They encourage parents to hide their behaviour like they were doing back 30 years ago when I started this research. And they mean that practitioners don't feel confident in having conversations about it. So the more we talk about it, the more people get trained and educated about it, etc. So that's it from me. Just to recap, I think you've gotten all these messages by now. I don't think there's anything on this slide that I haven't already said. So I'll just leave it up and let you think about whether you've got any questions you want to ask me. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much for that excellent lecture. Very interesting. So does anyone have any questions?
Do you want me to stop sharing and so I can see you all?
Sure. Inika?
Yeah, I'm just popping it into chat because I'm in a cafe at the moment.
Sure.
Yeah, is it?
So I don't know if you
see
can
that.
see.
Do babies need to sleep close to a caregiver or just to the mother? What happens when they're always close to a caregiver, but the caregiver varies in cultural contexts that have joint families with very diffuse caregiving roles? Is there any evolutionary research about what number of caregivers babies should have? And is there always an important distinction between primary and secondary caregivers? That's all right. That's a good question, and there is a fair amount of research that's been done about kind of multiple caregivers and the importance of kind of support for new mothers and extended families and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that is what evolutionary biologists argue is the way in which humans evolved to take care of babies, that they weren't designed, that we weren't designed to kind of like it be a one parent, one baby sort of situation. And that around the world, you know, you have multiple caregivers holding babies and carrying babies when mothers have got other things to do. The only situation really where the mother being the primary caregiver is important is with regards to breastfeeding and breast milk production. So if the mother doesn't get enough time with the baby to feed frequently in those early weeks and months, then a breast milk production can suffer. But that's why a lot of cultures also have kind of like that period after birth where new mothers and babies just hang out together and don't have to do much, and everybody does stuff for them before they have to start being productive and taking, you know, part in paid work or whatever. And we tend not to do that in this society anymore. We've sort of lost that lying in period, as the old-fashioned term for it. And new mums are up and running around and doing stuff almost immediately after they get home from the hospital, which I think is probably one of the things that contributes to insufficient milk and not getting breastfeeding established and stuff. So I think there's a few weeks at the very beginning where it's important that the mom is the person who's carrying and holding the baby. But I think after that, after breastfeeding is established and milk production is established, then sharing caregiving is what, you know, what is expected for humans.
Thank you so much.
And any other questions?
I had a question, if I may. You mentioned the 1920s, this idea of the scientific baby care, which focused more on self-reliance and independence, and maybe reduced affection. And I was wondering where those ideas came from, if there was some kind of root or any kind of pioneer studies at the time that were enforcing these ideas.
A lot of them were cultural. So it was kind of, and a lot of them came from America. And it was kind of the ideology of, you know, the self-made man, and the citizen, the kind of citizen that you wanted in a new and upcoming society, that they needed to be, you know, self-reliant, they needed to be hard workers, they needed to be resilient. And these were kind of desirable characteristics to create within your population. And that got translated to, that's the parent's job to create, you know, self-reliant children who'll become self-reliant adults who will be able to kind of like build this new country and this this economy, booming economy, until they had the depression, of course. But in the 1920s, that's where they thought they were going. Well, from like from the start of industrialization until the depression, that was kind of like the rhetoric in the States. And that's what John B. Watson was all about, was about kind of like what kind of psychology produces that kind of citizen, if you like. He wasn't really, he had a very convoluted career in some respects. He was in advertising and marketing before he got into all of this, using psychology again to kind of like sell stuff. But when he had children and he raised them according to these kind of behaviorist principles, which he, you know, promoted as being the best way to raise children, you can find accounts of his children's lives on the internet. They've written kind of like biographies about what it was like. And all of them ended up in some kind of therapy because of the way in which they were treated as children. And the lack of affection, etc. So there's some quite interesting stuff out there if you go and dig around for it, about John B. Watson and his exploits.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
I thought it was interesting, the over-reporting of sleep, and I wondered what the relationship with that and maternal well-being was. That if they think their babies are getting more sleep, do they think they're getting more sleep, and is there then this sort of positive association, and that they feel better in themselves, even when it's not necessarily a true reflection of what's going on?
I think there's a bit of that, that, you know, a kind of like a bit of self-delusion, if you like, that they're being effective parents and their babies are doing what their babies are supposed to be doing. And so the tendency is to sort of embellish that a little bit. Yeah, I think there's also the sort of one of the issues, I think, is that formula-fed babies tend to sleep a little bit further away from their parents than breastfed babies do. So while breastfed babies tend to be kind of like right next to the bed or in the bed, formula-fed babies might be moved earlier into another room, or they certainly might be across the room rather than right next to the bed. And so I suspect some of it is that the parents just aren't aware of the fact that their baby does wake during the night, because they can't feel it moving, or they maybe don't hear it snuffling or squeaking or whatever it's doing, unless it gets to a full-blown cry. So they might underreport for that reason as well.
So just thinking about the reporting and the measure, how I'm not a parent myself, so I have no kind of experience of it, but how much of baby being awake at night are they not crying? I think I wonder whether, as a non-parent, there is this kind of idea that when a baby wakes in the night, they immediately cry, as opposed to there being these periods of just being awake and fairly content.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of that. So yeah, in the very early studies, when they had babies in separate rooms and parents were supposed to be reporting whether the baby cried or fussed, that was basically what they were reporting, because the baby, you know, the baby had to get to screaming level for them to be able to hear it. But a lot of babies don't. They don't, you know, they wake up in the night, they sort of suck on their own hands, or, you know, they might kind of like kick about for a while and then they go back to sleep. They don't necessarily signal for their parents every time. And some of that depends on temperament. So some babies are much more sort of calm, and don't need somebody to come and, you know, help them go back to sleep, whereas other babies are much more high strung and they need to be calmed down every time they wake up. And I think, you know, when you've got a breastfed baby as well, when it wakes, if it can smell the milk, it'll make more of a fuss to come and feed. Whereas, you know, the formula-fed baby is not using its senses in the same way, because it doesn't, the smell of the milk is not a cue to feed. You know, it has to, you know, the parents have to go and fetch the milk from somewhere. So I think that the way in which parent-baby interaction around feeding happens is quite different for after the first couple of weeks. It's quite different for breastfed and formula-fed babies. Formula feeding parents tend to feed their babies by the clock a lot more, and breastfeeding babies tend to feed their babies based on the baby's cues, not frequently.
I know for friends of mine who have babies, there are apps and things where that I guess is it is a very new thing, and I don't know whether that sort of what effect that sort of hyper awareness of when your baby's feeding, how long they're feeding for, is sort of feeding into pun not intended, but feeding into the, you know, the way people are feeding their babies.
I think you're absolutely right. I wrote a paper for Nature Digital Medicine this past year with one of my PhD students, which was about digital tools that parents use with their babies, and the conclusion that we came to, having looked at all of these different things that were out there and available, is that a lot of them are actually designed to insert themselves between the parent and the baby and inform the parent about what's happening to their baby. So the parents are looking at their devices to learn about their baby instead of looking at their baby. And kind of, you know, as a biological anthropologist, I want them to look at the baby, not look at the app. But you know, it's a huge industry, and anything that you can produce that parts new parents from their money is going to be a bestseller, because it's one of the most, you know, the times when we shell out all sorts of money for everything that's available because we think that makes us good parents. So yeah, it's a lucrative market to create apps and things for new parents, but most of them aren't necessary. We managed to keep babies alive for millennia before we had apps.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, you discussed one of your PhD students' research around 2012 when they started to do the discussion groups with
the focus groups, yeah.
Yeah, the focus groups with new parents, and found that I guess some new perceptions, which I guess are really old perceptions about like what is acceptable, healthy, and natural for babies and how to care for them, were starting to come back and be on the rise. And I was wondering what different social or scientific factors led to this return to I guess pre-20th century industrialized thinking.
I think probably the easier access to information on, you know, internet and social media and stuff, for people who decide that they want to breastfeed, to find out about what's physiologically normal for breastfeeding mothers and babies. I think there's been an explosion of kind of information sites and Instagram accounts and, you know, all sorts of things kind of like supporting breastfeeding, bed sharing, baby wearing, you know, all of this kind of stuff is now much easier to find. It used to be really quite niche. You used to have to join the La Leche League, and, you know, it was kind of like an exclusive club of breastfeeding mums that had, you know, kind of like met in church halls and stuff in the 60s and the 70s, whereas now I think everybody can find that information. So I think just growing awareness among new mothers about how to find that information and where it is and the ease with which they can find it was kind of like coming through in those focus groups.
Yeah, thank you. And any other questions? Okay, yeah, thank you very much for this, for coming to give the talk.
You're very welcome.
Answering your questions. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you found it useful in some way.